The nature of memory is much like the shifting Nebraska prairie. It appears vast and unchanging at a distance. Yet upon closer inspection, it is a restless sea of tall grass and hidden hollows, concealing more than it ever truly reveals. We often believe that the land forgets the tragedies visited upon it, that the wind scouring the plains carries away the echoes of old grievances, leaving the soil clean for the next season's planting. But the earth has a long memory, and sometimes the silence of a quiet town is not a sign of peace, but rather a held breath, a collective waiting for a storm that has already passed to finally settle its accounts. Tonight, we find ourselves traveling back to the spring of 1906, specifically to the rugged, wind-swept landscape of Crawford, Nebraska. It is a place where the edges of the civilized world met the disciplined lines of military life. A town defined by the presence of Fort Robinson and the men of the 9th and 10th Cavalry who called those barracks home. Among those men was Sergeant John Reid, a member of Troop B of the 10th United States Cavalry. Reid was a man of service, a soldier who understood the weight of a uniform and the rhythm of a life governed by bugle calls and polished brass. He was a man who found a sense of order in the structure of the military, a grounding reality in a world that often felt unpredictable. Beside him, we find Private Jordan Taylor, a younger man, perhaps more spirited, yet bound by the same codes of conduct and the same shared experiences of a black soldier in a frontier town at the dawn of a new century. These men were not merely figures in a ledger. They were individuals who walked the dusty streets of Crawford, who felt the bite of the Nebraska winter and the sudden, blooming warmth of a May evening. They were men with histories, with quiet ambitions, and with the heavy knowledge that their presence in the town was often met with a scrutiny that few others had to endure. By the evening of May 13th, 1906, the air in Crawford had begun to carry the sweet, heavy scent of damp earth and new growth. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and fading gold. It was a night that should have been defined by rest, by the simple pleasure of a beer party held by the soldiers near the city park on the western edge of town. There is a specific kind of atmospheric drift that occurs in these moments. The low murmur of voices, the clinking of glass, the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets in the tall grass. The tension of the day's duties typically unwinds in the cool evening air, replaced by a temporary stillness. However, beneath this surface calm, a deeper, more jagged history was pulsing. A year prior, following the Independence Day horse races of 1905, a sharp disagreement had flared between Sergeant Reid and the Crawford City Marshal, a man named Arthur Moss. The details of that initial spark had faded into the general background noise of town life, but the embers remained hot, buried under a thin layer of professional distance. Arthur Moss was a man of the law, a figure of authority in a town that prided itself on its independence. On this particular Sunday night, he was dispatched to the soldiers gathering with orders to quiet the celebration or disperse it entirely. As he approached the edge of the park, the mundane details of the scene, the smell of spent tobacco, the cooling embers of a small fire, the shadows stretching long across the grass, became the stage for a sudden and irreversible collision. The confrontation was not a cinematic explosion. It was a brief, frantic scuffle. a moment where years of simmering animosity and the weight of immediate pressure converged. In the confusion of the shadows and the shouting, a .38 caliber revolver was drawn. A shot rang out, a sharp metallic crack that tore through the evening stillness. Arthur Moss fell, the life draining from him in the dirt of the park he was sworn to protect. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. For Reid and Taylor, the world had suddenly shifted on its axis. The protective frame of their military status had vanished, replaced by the raw, cold reality of a dead lawman and a gathering crowd, driven by an instinctive, desperate need for safety. The two soldiers fled the scene, their boots pounding rhythmically against the hard-packed earth as they disappeared into the darkening streets of Crawford. They sought refuge at the home of Edna Ewing, an elderly African-American resident whose house offered a temporary sanctuary of familiar shadows and weathered wood. But the peace was an illusion. The town was waking up, fueled by rumors that spread like wildfire through the parlors and saloons. The sound of pursuit followed them. The shouts of men and the occasional terrifying crack of a rifle as civilians fired into the night, hunting for the men who had vanished into the gloom. As a crowd began to coalesce around the Ewing house, the tension reached a breaking point. Inside, the air must have felt thick with the smell of old dust and the sharp tang of fear. Private Jordan Taylor, perhaps feeling the walls closing in, made a fateful decision. He bolted from the house, a dark silhouette sprinting toward the distant safety of Fort Robinson. He didn't make it. In the chaos of the pursuit, he was fatally wounded, his journey ending in the tall grass before he could reach the gates of the fort. Sergeant Reid, however, remained. He was eventually captured, not by a mob, but by the hands of an authority that felt increasingly fragile. He was taken to the city jail, a small, cramped space that offered little comfort against the rising tide of public anger. Throughout the night, the atmosphere in Crawford was one of profound, electric unease. At the fort, Colonel Auger realized that the situation was spiraling toward a potential massacre. Word reached the officials that several men and rifles were missing from the Troop B barracks, a sign that the soldiers were not prepared to let their comrade be taken without a fight. To prevent a lynching or an all-out battle, the colonel dispatched Troops 1 and K into the town. The sight of uniformed guards surrounding the jailhouse in the pre-dawn light was a chilling reminder of how quickly the order of society could crumble. The investigation would later reveal 14 rifles concealed near the town limits, silent witnesses to a plan that was never fully enacted. By the next morning, the urgency had shifted to a grim, process-oriented caution. To ensure his survival, Reid was moved 24 miles away to the jail in Chaudron. The landscape he traveled through was the same one he had known as a soldier. Yet it must have looked entirely different through the bars of a transport carriage. The horizon felt further away, the light more clinical. The legal machinery began its slow, deliberate grind. Reid was eventually tried and convicted of manslaughter. The sentence was 7 years in the Nebraska State Prison, a far cry from the life of a sergeant in the 10th Cavalry. As we reflect on that deadly night in May, we see a story not of sudden monsters, but of men caught in the gears of history and personal pride. The danger has long since faded, The graves of Moss and Taylor are quiet, and the barracks of Fort Robinson stand as silent monuments to a different era. The land has reclaimed the hoof prints and the echoes of the gunfire. You are safe now, tucked away from the reaching shadows of the past. The Nebraska wind continues to blow, a soft, steady drone that lulls the world to sleep, carrying no more threats, only the gentle weight of time passing over the plains. The investigation is closed, the sentence is served, and the night is once again still. The transition from the open plains of Nebraska to the rugged, burgeoning landscape of the Pacific Northwest in 1909 marks a shift in the atmosphere. Yet the underlying current of human nature remains a constant, steady hum. We find ourselves now in Spokane, Washington, a city defined by the scent of fresh pine timber and the cold, rushing waters of the Spokane River. It was a place of reinvention, where the shadows of the pines offered a quiet sanctuary for those looking to leave their pasts behind. Among those who moved through the misty streets of Spokane was Paul Kleen, a 36-year-old German immigrant whose life had been shaped by the rigid discipline of the German army and the rugged demands of the mounted police in British Columbia. He was a man of calculated movements and a stoic expression, a person who understood the mechanics of authority and the weight of a uniform. On the evening of March 1st, 1909, the air in Spokane carried the lingering chill of winter, a damp cold that settled into the bones of those walking the cobblestones. Inside a warm German bakery, the air was thick with the comforting, yeasty scent of browning crusts and the soft hiss of steam. Paul Kleen sat at a wooden table across from John Sodowski, a Polish immigrant in his late 30s. To any observer, they were simply two friends sharing a late supper, their voices low and steady against the backdrop of clinking porcelain and the distant rumble of the city settling in for the night. They ate a meal of beans, a simple and grounding sustenance, unaware that this mundane act of dining would later become a focal point for a grim forensic timeline. 3 weeks passed, and the initial stillness of that March evening was replaced by a growing unease. The silence was finally broken when Sodowski's body was discovered on the outskirts of the city, within the boundaries of the Fort George Wright military reservation. The landscape there was a tapestry of basalt outcroppings and hardy evergreens, a place where the wind whistled through the barracks and the ground remained hard and unforgiving. The discovery was a heavy intrusion upon the order of the military post. When the city coroners performed the autopsy, they looked past the charred remains to find a narrative written in the physical evidence. Inside Sodowski's stomach, they found the partially undigested beans from that final meal at the bakery, a detail that placed the time of his passing at a mere 2 to 4 hours after he had last been seen in the company of Paul Kleen. The investigation moved with a methodical, heavy pace. 2.32 caliber bullets were recovered, one from the victim's neck and another from his skull. Small leaden weights that held the gravity of the entire case. Detectives soon learned that Kleen had recently traded away a pistol of that exact caliber, a piece of information that acted like a tightening thread. When confronted in the sterile, dimly lit environment of the interrogation room, Kleen remained a tough customer. His military background had gifted him with a particular kind of resilience, a steady pulse even under the glare of suspicion. He denied the trade, claiming instead that he had given the weapon to his fiancée, Mrs. Ida Douglas, a month prior. Ida, however, remained a silent figure in the periphery, offering neither an alibi nor confirmation, her quietude adding to the thickening fog of the investigation. Klein's history began to unravel under the persistent gaze of the law. He was not merely a former soldier. He was a man who had navigated multiple lives and identities. In the quiet corners of his hotel room, investigators found a hidden compartment in his trunk, a space that smelled of old wood and secrets. Within it, they discovered his true name, Paul Krasnensky. This discovery shifted the perspective of the case, revealing a man who had buried his past in the snowy reaches of Canada, where a wife and child had been lost to time. The narrative of the stoic immigrant was being replaced by something more complex and fractured. The weight of the evidence continued to settle. Wagon tracks found near the recovery site matched a rented buggy with distinctive yellow running gears, a splash of bright color in the gray Spokane morning. Witnesses remembered seeing that specific carriage near the fort on the morning of March 2nd. The same morning, Klein's time card showed him arriving 2 hours late to his place of employment. In his room, alongside the tools he had taken from his employer, were love letters from May Randall, a woman described as a beautiful blonde who favored the latest fashions of British Columbia. These letters revealed a desperate need for funds, contrasting sharply with the $30 found in Klein's pockets. Money his co-workers knew he did not have only days before. The image of the unoffending Pole Saudowski and the calculated movements of his companion began to coalesce into a singular, tragic history. As the legal proceedings began, the tension of the crime was replaced by the slow, grinding machinery of the court. Klein was found guilty and sentenced to death, yet he maintained a posture of self-righteous innocence, even offering to catch the real killer if only he were set free. This proposition was met with a weary laughter by the prosecutors, who saw in Klein the most persistent liar the county had encountered in years. Even as his case moved from state to federal jurisdiction due to the location of the body, the outcome remained a shadow that followed him. By 1911, he was sentenced to life, a quiet conclusion to a life lived in the fringes of order and chaos. He passed away 3 years later in the silence of McNeil Island Federal Prison, leaving behind only a nameless marker in the prison cemetery. The heavy gates of the past have long since closed on the story of Paul Klein, and the hills surrounding Spokane remain peaceful, the secrets of the military reservation buried deep beneath the pine needles and the passing years. We can rest now, knowing that the complexities of that era have faded into the soft, gray light of history. The legacy of human behavior often leaves behind more than just memories. It leaves a trail of physical artifacts that anchor us to the past. Tonight, as the stars hang low over the Central Valley of California, we turn our attention towards Stockton. It is a place of rich soil and winding waterways, where the delta breeze carries the scent of the earth through the quiet streets. In this landscape of agriculture and transition, we find the story of Emma Ledoux, a woman whose life was a complex tapestry of reinvention and shadow. Born Emma Head in the gold country of Amador County, she was raised in a family of comfortable means, far from the desperation one might expect of a woman whose name would eventually be whispered in the halls of the state's most notorious institutions. Emma was a woman of striking presence, someone who moved through the world with an air of refined belonging, even as the foundations of her personal life shifted beneath her feet. We see her first in the early chapters of her adulthood, moving through a series of marriages that seemed to dissolve as quickly as they formed. There was Mr. Barrett in Fresno, then a man named Williams in Arizona, whose passing under peculiar circumstances left Emma with a significant insurance payout. By 1902, she had wed Albert McVicker in the dusty heat of Bisbee. Though the union was short-lived, Emma was a traveler of the heart, always looking toward the next horizon, eventually finding herself in a bigamous marriage with Eugene Ledoux in Woodland, while still legally bound to McVicker. The geography of her life narrowed significantly in March of 1906. It was then that McVicker, unaware of his wife's dual life, met her in Stockton. They moved through the city like any other couple of the era, the sound of their leather-soled shoes echoing on the floor of Bruner's furniture store as they picked out pieces for a home that would never be built. They stayed at the California Hotel, a place of transient comfort where the ticking of the lobby clock marked the final days of a man who believed he was starting a new chapter as a farm superintendent. The air in their room likely smelled of the bay rum McVicker favored, and the faint, medicinal scent of the morphine Emma had acquired from a local doctor under the guise of an addiction. It was a domestic scene draped in the heavy velvet of deception, a quiet prelude to the discovery that would soon arrive at the Stockton depot, forever changing the way the city looked at a simple wooden trunk. While the echoes of the Ledoux trial were still settling into the heavy archives of California's legal history, a different kind of tension was simmering nearly 1,000 miles to the east, in the high plains landscape of the Nebraska Panhandle. On the evening of May 13th, 1906, the town of Crawford was transitioning from the golden, dusty heat of a late spring afternoon into the sharp, biting chill of a prairie night. There is a specific quality to the air in this part of the country during May, where the scent of dry buffalo grass, cured by the sun, mingles with the bitter, comforting tang of wood smoke drifting from kitchen fires as families settle in for their final meal of the day. We find ourselves walking the packed dirt streets of Crawford, a town that existed in a delicate, often fractured balance with the nearby military post of Fort Robinson. The rhythmic, hollow thud of a horse's hooves on the hardened earth provides a steady meter to the evening, a sound that usually signaled the routine movement of life in a frontier hub. But beneath this atmospheric anchoring, a storm was gathering. The peace of the high plains is often deceptive, masking the long-standing animosities that grow in the isolation of the frontier. For over a year, a quiet war of nerves had been playing out between the town's authorities and the soldiers stationed at the fort. Specifically, the men of Troop B of the 10th United States Cavalry, the storied Buffalo Soldiers, found themselves living in a state of constant friction with the local citizenry. The center of this friction was Crawford City Marshal Arthur Moss, a man of the law with a reputation for a firm, sometimes abrasive hand. Moss had nearly come to blows with Sergeant John Reid of Troop B during the previous summer's 4th of July horse races. That confrontation had never truly ended. It had simply moved into the shadows, waiting for a catalyst to bring it back into the light. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the city park on the west edge of town, a group of soldiers gathered for a beer party. It was meant to be a moment of levity, a brief escape from the rigid discipline of military life. They could not have known that this cool May evening would be the last moment of quiet they would ever experience. The transition from the mundane sounds of a social gathering to the sharp report of a revolver would happen in a heartbeat, shattering the carefully maintained stillness of the Nebraska night, and setting a tragedy in motion that would be remembered for decades to come. The geography of the Pine Ridge region in 1906 was a landscape of stark, haunting transitions, where the rolling sea of the Nebraska high plains crashed against the jagged, pine-crested ridges of the White River Valley. To the north and west, the terrain fractured into the shadows of the Black Hills, a wilderness of sandstone and ponderosa that seemed to hold its breath in the heat of the afternoon. This was a land defined by its extremes, biting, wind-scoured winters and summers so dry the grass turned to a brittle, golden tinder by early July. In the heart of this rugged expanse sat Fort Robinson, a sprawling collection of red brick barracks and weathered stables that served as the silent anchor for the 10th United States Cavalry. For the men of Troop B, the fort was a world governed by the uncompromising geometry of the parade ground and the relentless rhythm of the sun. The daily life of these soldiers was a study in disciplined endurance. The morning began long before the light touched the ridges, announced by the sharp, metallic ting of the bugle that cut through the thin mountain air like a blade. This sound, cold and clear, summoned the men from their narrow bunks to face a day of labor that left little room for the mind to wander. There was the constant, heavy scent of saddle soap, dry hay, and the oily musk of the horses that were their constant companions. The navy blue wool of their cavalry uniforms was thick and coarse, a fabric that trapped the heat in the summer and gathered the fine, alkaline dust of the plains until every crease was etched in gray. When they moved, the brass buttons of their tunics would clink softly against their equipment, a rhythmic accompaniment to the jingle of spurs that followed them across the packed earth of the post. In the nearby town of Crawford, the atmosphere was different, though no less structured by the tensions of the frontier. The town was a collection of storefronts and houses tethered together by wooden boardwalks that functioned as the stage for every social interaction. These walkways were prone to warping in the harsh sun, and they creaked with a distinctive, hollow thud under the weight of a soldier's boot, a sound that signaled their arrival long before they reached the door of a shop or a tavern. To the townspeople, that rhythmic cadence was a reminder of the military presence that both protected their commerce and challenged their sense of local autonomy. The soldiers of Troop B were men who lived in the narrow space between the rigid expectations of the Army and the shifting, often cold reception of the civilian world. Their evenings were often spent in the pursuit of small comforts, the warmth of a shared beer, the low murmur of conversation in the city park, or the fleeting peace of a sunset that turned the ridges a deep, bruised purple. They moved through Crawford as a cohesive unit, their shared experiences in the saddle forging bonds that were as tight as the stitches in their leather reins. Yet, As the spring of 1906 deepened, the quiet routine of the frontier began to feel increasingly fragile. The air in the streets seemed to carry a weight it hadn't before, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The history of this land was written in the dust and the pine needles, but a new, darker chapter was being prepared in the shadows of the boardwalks, waiting for a single spark to ignite the dry timber of old animosities. The air in Crawford that evening carried the sharp, metallic scent of a coming storm, though the sky remained deceptively clear. It was May 13th, 1906, a date that would forever be etched into the local memory as the night the fragile peace between the town and the fort finally shattered. For over a year, a cold friction had existed between City Marshal Arthur Moss and Sergeant John Reid of Troop B. The two men were like flint and steel, having nearly come to blows during the previous year's Independence Day celebrations. That lingering resentment was a heavy, invisible weight that followed them through the dusty streets, a shadow that never quite receded, even in the brightest Nebraska sun. When word reached Marshal Moss that a group of soldiers was holding a beer party near the city park on the western edge of town, he did not hesitate. He moved toward the sound of distant laughter and clinking glass, his footsteps steady on the cooling earth. The park was a place of leisure for many, but for Moss it was now a scene of potential disorder that required his firm hand. Upon arrival, he found the men of Troop B, including Sergeant Reid and Private Jordan Taylor. The command to quiet down or disperse was given with the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed, but the response he received was not the usual begrudging compliance. An altercation flared up with the suddenness of a lightning strike. In the chaotic scuffle that followed, the darkness of the park was momentarily illuminated by the flash of a .38 caliber revolver. The report of the gun echoed off the nearby trees, a sharp, final sound that signaled the end of more than just the evening's festivities. Sergeant Reid had pulled the trigger, and Arthur Moss, the man who had stood as the symbol of Crawford's law, was mortally wounded. He would pass away shortly after, leaving behind a town that was rapidly transforming from a quiet frontier outpost into a tinderbox of racial and social fury. Terrified by the gravity of what had transpired, Reid and Taylor did not return to the safety of Fort Robinson. Instead, they vanished into the winding streets of Crawford, seeking refuge in the home of Edna Ewing, an elderly black resident whose house offered a temporary sanctuary from the rising heat of the night. Their escape was not a silent one. Several civilians, gripped by a sudden and violent impulse, followed the soldiers through the shadows, firing shots that hissed through the air. The tension in the town was no longer a simmer. It was a boiling over of ancient fears and new hatreds. As a crowd began to coalesce around the Ewing house, the pressure became too much for Private Taylor. In a moment of desperate bravery, or perhaps pure panic, he bolted from the house, sprinting toward the distant silhouette of the fort. He didn't make it far. The civilians watching the house opened fire, and Taylor fell, fatally wounded before he could reach the safety of the military reservation. Reid, seeing his companion fall, remained trapped until he was eventually captured and placed under heavy guard in the local city jail. The night did not bring sleep to Crawford. Rumors, those jagged whispers that thrive in the dark, began to circulate that the soldiers of Troop B were preparing to storm the jail to liberate their sergeant. Fearing a lynching at the hands of a civilian mob or a bloody skirmish with the military, city officials made the frantic decision to move Reid to the jail in Chadron, 24 miles away. The arrival of Troops 1 and K from the fort, sent by Colonel Auger to prevent further bloodshed, did little to calm the nerves of the townspeople. Soldier guards surrounded the jailhouse, their rifles gleaming under the lanterns, as 14 missing rifles from the barracks were later found concealed near the town limits. A silent testament to how close the night had come to a full-scale insurrection. Reid was eventually moved under the cover of the morning light, later to be convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 7 years in the state prison, leaving the town of Crawford to pick up the pieces of a night that had changed everything. The quiet farmland southwest of Bostwick, Nebraska, rarely saw the kind of drama that unfolded in the late autumn of 1903. Eli Feasel was a man of routine, a farmer whose life was measured by the seasons and the soil. When he vanished on November 1st, the silence that took his place was deeply unsettling to those who knew him. His housekeeper, Nanny Hutchinson, offered a simple explanation. Eli had gone to Kansas City to visit his son. It was a plausible story, the kind of mundane detail that usually puts an end to questions. But for Eli's brother Thomas, the math didn't add up. His inquiries to Kansas City returned nothing but empty echoes. Eli had never arrived. Suspicion is a slow-growing vine, but once it takes root, it is difficult to pull out. The investigation centered quickly on Nanny and her 21-year-old son, Charles. However, the law in 1903 required more than just a missing person and a suspicious feeling. Without a body or concrete evidence of a struggle, the authorities were forced to release the mother and son after an initial hearing. For a few months, it seemed as though the secret of Eli Feasel might remain buried forever beneath the Nebraska sod. The turn of the seasons, however, has a way of revealing what the winter tries to hide. In the spring of 1904, a man named Mr. Stanley began working the Feasel land. As his plow turned over the dark, rich earth, he came across something that the frost had kept secret: a shallow, newly opened grave. The discovery was grisly and undeniable. A human hand, shocks of hair, and a coat containing an empty whiskey bottle. The earth had finally spoken, and the message was one of murder. The behavior of Charles Hutchinson during this time became increasingly erratic. He had been seen watching Mr. Stanley work the fields, his eyes darting with a nervous energy that did not go unnoticed. On May 6th, he rented a buggy under the guise of traveling to the Starkey Ranch. But when he returned the rig the next morning, the horses were lathered and exhausted, far beyond what a short trip would require. More tellingly, a foul, unmistakable stench clung to the cushions of the carriage. Investigators realized that Charles and Nanny had attempted to move the remains under the cover of night, unaware that they were leaving behind footprints in the soft mud that perfectly matched their own shoes. The trial that followed did not take long to reach its conclusion. Both mother and son were found guilty of second-degree murder, their attempt to outrun the truth ending in the cold iron of a prison cell. The passage of time often acts as a sedative, dulling the sharp edges of old grudges until we believe they have dissolved into the earth. Yet, in the small, wind-swept town of Crawford, Nebraska, the roots of bitterness grew deep and remarkably resilient. We find ourselves looking back to a Tuesday in May, 1906. But to understand the heavy atmosphere of that spring morning, we must first travel back nearly a year to the sweltering heat of July 4th, 1905. The celebration of the nation's birth had brought the townspeople and the soldiers of Fort Robinson together for the horse races. But the festive air was thin and brittle. The sun that day was a physical weight, pressing the smell of dry prairie grass and cheap, fermenting cider into the crowded stands. Dust, kicked up by the thundering hooves of the horses, hung in the stagnant air, sticking to sweaty skin and coating the tongues of men who had already had too much to drink. It was in this haze of heat and noise that City Marshal Arthur Moss first locked eyes with Sergeant John Reid of Troop B, 10th United States Cavalry. Moss was a man who took his authority with a grim, unyielding seriousness, while Reid, a veteran of the prestigious Buffalo Soldiers, carried the quiet confidence of a man who had earned his rank through discipline and fire. The initial dispute was a spark in a tinder box, a minor disagreement over conduct at the track. But the visual memory of that moment would haunt the witnesses for months to come. As words were exchanged, the crowd fell into a sudden, localized silence. Moss's hand did not move to his gun, but it hovered with a predatory stillness near his holster, his fingers twitching with a subconscious intent that everyone present understood. Reid did not flinch. He stood his ground with a soldier's rigidity, his face a mask of controlled defiance. Though the confrontation was eventually de-escalated by cooler heads, the peace that followed was a fragile thing, more of a truce than a resolution. For the next 10 months, that shadow lingered over Crawford. Every time Moss walked his beat and saw the dark blue uniforms of the 10th Cavalry, he felt the phantom itch of that July heat. Every time Reid led his men into town for a few hours of hard-earned rest, he felt the weight of the marshal's gaze. By the time the clock struck 5 a.m. on May 13, 1906, the tension had reached a terminal density. The morning began with a deceptive calm, the dew clinging to the wooden storefronts of Main Street. But the collision between the lawman and the soldier was no longer a matter of if, but when. The long shadow of that July afternoon was finally reaching its end, preparing to give way to a night that would leave the town forever changed. By the time the sun began its slow descent over the Nebraska Panhandle on May 13, 1906, the heat of the day had softened into a violet haze. This was the hour when the rigid lines of military life at Fort Robinson usually began to blur, as the men of Troop B sought a brief reprieve from the watchful eyes of their commanding officers. They drifted toward the western edge of Crawford, settling into a small, grassy sanctuary near the city park where the White River whispered against its banks. This was not a gathering of rebels, but a quiet assembly of men seeking the simple, restorative power of fellowship. We find them there, a sensory bubble of safety carved out of a world that often felt jagged and unkind. The evening air carried the scent of crushed prairie grass and the sharp, clean tang of malt. Several dozen glass bottles sat nestled in a shallow, cool depression in the earth, their surfaces slick with cold condensation that caught the fading light like dark jewels. The sound of the gathering was a low, melodic hum, the rhythmic cadence of black soldiers laughing in the dark, their voices vibrating with a warmth that only comes when the weight of the uniform is momentarily set aside. They spoke of home, of the long marches through the dust, and of the small comforts that made the soldier's life bearable. It was a scene of profound, ordinary peace. Yet it was a peace built upon a foundation of thin glass. The transition from tranquility to tension did not happen with a shout, but with the sudden, sharp crack of a dry twig under a heavy boot. Arthur Moss approached from the deepening shadows of the park trees, his silhouette cutting a hard, uncompromising line against the twilight. The laughter among the men of Troop B did not die out all at once. It withered, row by row, as the city marshal stepped into the soft glow of their lantern light. Moss did not come as a neighbor or a fellow citizen of the plains. He came as a reminder of the authority that had been simmering with resentment since the previous July. The condensation on the beer bottles continued to drip, rhythmic and slow, marking the seconds as Moss stood over the seated men. He ordered the party to quiet down, his voice carrying a jagged edge that sliced through the cool evening air. He spoke of ordinances and public peace, but the men looking up at him heard something else. The echo of a year-old grudge that had never been allowed to cool. Sergeant John Reid and Private Jordan Taylor remained still, their bodies tensing as the marshal's shadow stretched over them, long and dark, reaching toward a climax that had been nearly a year in the making. The melodic hum of the night was gone, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt as though the very air had turned to stone. The space between the men narrowed until the air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, kinetic hum. Marshal Arthur Moss stood as a silhouette of civic order against the flickering amber light of the dying campfire, his hand resting near the leather of his holster. Before him, Sergeant John Reid and Private Jordan Taylor did not move with the fluidity of men caught in a simple celebration. They moved with the rigid, defensive posture of soldiers who felt the weight of a year's worth of unspoken grievances. The scent of the evening had shifted. The sweet aroma of the park's grass and the crispness of the spring air being overtaken by the sharper, more industrial smells of military life. The pungent tang of gun oil and the heavy, earthy musk of unwashed wool uniforms that had seen too many miles on the Nebraska plains. When Moss spoke, his voice was not a plea for peace, but a cold command to disperse, a friction point that finally ignited the stagnant air. The scuffle began not with a shout, but with the sudden rhythmic scuff of boot leather against the dirt. In the darkness, the mechanics of the struggle were clinical and frantic. Hands reached out, grasping at fabric and brass buttons, the sound of labored breathing filling the small gap between their chests. Amidst the tangle of limbs, Reid's hand found the familiar, devastating weight of his .38 caliber revolver. The steel was unnervingly cold against his palm, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from the bodies locked in combat. It felt solid, a heavy anchor of finality in a world that had suddenly become fluid and chaotic. The transition from tension to tragedy happened in a heartbeat. As the men lunged and parried in the shadows, the phut of a muzzle flash tore through the night, a brief, violent bloom of orange and white light. For a microsecond, the world was frozen in a high contrast. The flash illuminated the startled, wide-eyed faces of the combatants, the grit on their skin, the desperation in their eyes, and the sudden realization of what had just occurred. Then, As quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving the darkness deeper and more oppressive than before. Arthur Moss stumbled back. The momentum of the confrontation evaporated. The marshal, who had spent so many months nursing a grudge after a simple horse race, now felt the warmth of his own life slipping away into the Nebraska soil. According to the accounts that would later surface, he died shortly after the lead found its mark, leaving a vacuum of leadership in the park. Reid and Taylor did not stay to witness the aftermath. Driven by a primal instinct for survival and a well-founded fear of what the townspeople would do to two black soldiers who had killed a white lawman, they turned and vanished into the labyrinth of Crawford's side streets. By the time the echo of the shot had faded, the beer party had scattered, leaving only the smell of burnt powder and the stillness of a life abruptly ended. Not long after, the first cries of alarm would begin to rise from the edge of town, signaling the start of a pursuit that would turn the quiet night into a theater of desperate flight. The boots of Sergeant John Reid and Private Jordan Taylor struck the dry, uneven dirt of the Crawford streets with a frantic, rhythmic desperation. They did not speak as they ran, their breath coming in ragged hitches that burned in the cold night air. Behind them, the town was no longer a collection of sleeping shadows. It had become a waking hive of silver light and shouted threats. The sharp crack of civilian rifles began to punctuate the wind, the lead balls whistling past them to thud into the wooden siding of darkened storefronts or whistle harmlessly into the brush. Every lantern flickering to life in a window felt like a spotlight, every silhouette on a porch a potential executioner. They were men of the 10th Cavalry, soldiers who had faced the vastness of the frontier. Yet in these narrow corridors of civilization, the world had never felt smaller or more predatory. They banked hard around a corner, the silhouettes of their pursuers momentarily lost behind a row of merchant stalls, and saw the modest, darkened profile of a house they recognized. It belonged to Edna Ewing, an elderly black resident whose home had long served as a quiet sanctuary for soldiers seeking a moment of peace away from the rigid lines of the fort or the growing hostility of the town. Without a word, they scrambled toward the porch, their shadows stretching long and distorted under the pale moon. The door opened just enough to let them slip inside, a sliver of warmth and safety in a night that had turned cold and lethal. Inside the Ewing home, the chaos of the street was instantly muffled, replaced by an atmosphere so thick with the mundane details of a quiet life that it felt surreal. The air tasted of wood stove ash and the sharp, medicinal tang of dried sage hanging from the rafters. It was the smell of a home that had seen years of slow, methodical living, a stark contrast to the sudden, violent rupture of the evening. In the hallway, a tall pendulum clock stood as a sentinel of the passing seconds, its heavy brass weight swinging with a rhythmic, mechanical tock-tock that seemed to mark the heartbeat of the house itself. Edna moved with a practiced, silent efficiency, reaching past the trembling soldiers to slide the heavy iron bolt into its housing. The sound was definitive, a low metallic thud that signaled the boundary between the hunted and the hunters. Outside, the spring wind began to pick up, fine the narrow gaps in the aging floorboards, and whistling with a mournful, high-pitched tone that sounded like a distant human cry. For a few moments, the only other sound was the heavy, labored heaving of Reid and Taylor's lungs as they leaned against the wood of the door, their hands still gripping the cold steel of their weapons. They stood in the dim light of a single dying ember in the hearth, surrounded by the quiet comforts of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know when the shadows were closing in. There were lace doilies on the small side tables, and the faint, lingering scent of baked bread, anchors of a normal world that now felt leagues away. Reid looked at Taylor, the private's eyes wide and reflecting the dim orange glow of the stove. The gravity of the killing of Marshal Moss sat between them like a physical weight, heavier than the rifles they carried. The silence of the house remained unbroken for a long minute, a fragile peace maintained only by the thickness of the walls and the strength of the iron bolt. But even then, they could hear the muffled sounds of the gathering crowd outside, the indistinct murmur of voices and the crunch of gravel under many feet. The refuge of Edna Ewing was a sanctuary, but as the minutes ticked by on the hallway clock, it began to feel less like a fortress and more like a trap. The sudden, sharp crack of a breaking window pane shattered the fragile quiet inside the Ewing cottage, signaling that the boundary between the house and the street had finally dissolved. Jordan Taylor, a man whose life had been defined by the rigid discipline of the 10th Cavalry, felt that discipline give way to a primal, driving need for the open air. He could no longer stay within the wooden ribs of the house, while the air outside grew thick with the scent of pine smoke and brewing hostility. Without a word to Sergeant Reid or their elderly host, Taylor threw himself toward the rear exit, his boots hitting the porch with a hollow thud before he vanished into the shadows of the Nebraska night. He knew the way back to Fort Robinson, a straight, desperate line across the rugged terrain, and he believed that if he could only reach the sanctuary of the post, the rules of military law would shield him from the unchecked fury of the town. The geography of his run was a gauntlet of shifting textures and deceptive light. As he cleared the immediate perimeter of the residential cluster, the ground transitioned from packed dirt to the loose, sandy soil characteristic of the White River Valley. Each stride was a struggle. The earth seemed to conspire against his escape, sliding and giving way under his heels, forcing his muscles to burn with a deep, rhythmic ache. To his left, the White River snaked through the darkness, its surface catching the moon's glow to create a long, silver sheen that looked like a fallen blade in the grass. The beauty of the landscape was lost on him, serving only as a marker for how much distance remained between his current peril and the safety of the barracks. As he sprinted, the sounds of Crawford began to morph. What had been distinct shouts and the recognizable cadence of angry men merged into a dull, low roar, a collective sound of pursuit that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Then came the whistle, a high, thin, zipping sound that cut through the wind. The first shots were fired not with a thunderous boom, but with a sharp, aggressive sting of hornets passing inches from his ears. He didn't look back to see who was pulling the triggers. He only focused on the silhouette of the bluffs in the distance, the silent sentinels that guarded the fort. The adrenaline began to mask the cold night air filling his lungs, but it could not steady the horizon. Every few yards, a flash of light from the town side illuminated the sagebrush, followed by the puff of dust where a lead ball struck the dry earth. Taylor was a soldier, trained for the front lines, Yet there was a singular, isolating terror in being hunted across an open field by neighbors and strangers alike. The distance to the fort, usually a short ride, now felt like an infinite expanse of silver and shadow. His breath came in ragged, silver plumes, and the weight of his own uniform felt like an anchor. Just as the dark outline of the military reservation boundaries seemed to draw within reach, the frequency of the whistles increased. The roar behind him didn't fade. It grew more rhythmic, more certain. Taylor's fatal attempt to bridge the gap between the civilian world that had rejected him and the military world that owned him was nearing its conclusion, leaving only the sound of his labored gasping and the relentless drumming of boots on the cooling Nebraska sand. The rhythmic drumming of the pursuit eventually gave way to a heavy, suffocating stillness. But for John Reid, the silence of the Crawford City Jail was far more predatory than the chaos of the streets. He sat on the edge of a narrow cot, the iron frame groaning under his weight, his hands resting on his knees. The air in the small cell was thick with the smell of damp stone, old tobacco, and the metallic, sharp taste of copper that coated his tongue. A lingering reminder of the adrenaline and the physical struggle that had led to his capture. A single kerosene lamp hung in the hallway, its yellow flame flickering in a draft that shouldn't have existed. Each time the light wavered, it cast long, trembling shadows of the vertical bars against the far wall, making it seem as though the very cage were breathing, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of his own shallow breath. Beyond those stone walls, the town of Crawford was no longer a collection of homes and businesses. It had transformed into a single, pulsing organism of resentment. We can imagine the sound that reached Reid through the high, narrow window. A low, guttural murmur that lacked the distinctness of human speech. It was a sound like a disturbed beehive, a collective drone of voices vibrating with a frequency that signaled imminent violence. Occasionally, the drone would be pierced by a sound far more clinical and chilling. The sharp, mechanical clack of Winchester rifles being levered. Each metallic snap told a story of a round entering a chamber, a physical preparation for a confrontation that the local authorities were increasingly powerless to prevent. The civilian mob gathered with a singular purpose, their anger fueled by the death of Marshal Moss and the deep-seated tensions that had simmered since the previous summer's races. Inside the cell, the darkness seemed to press against Reid's chest, the weight of his situation settling in the pit of his stomach like cold lead. He was a soldier, a man trained for the order of the cavalry. Yet he found himself trapped in the center of a storm that defied all military logic. The local officials, sensing the shift in the crowd's temperament, began to whisper of a transfer to Chadron, fearing that the jail's locks would not hold against the sheer weight of the men standing in the shadows of the street. Just as the tension reached a point where the air itself felt brittle, a new sensation began to manifest. It started as a subtle, rhythmic vibration in the soles of Reid's feet, a trembling in the floorboards that preceded any audible sound. Slowly, the vibration grew into a thunderous resonance. We hear the approach of Troops 1 and K, a force of 100 horses moving in synchronized purpose. The sound was unmistakable to a cavalryman. The rhythmic strike of 400 hooves hitting the hard-packed earth, the melodic jingle of steel bridles, and the heavy, synchronized breathing of the animals as they were reined in. The soldiers formed a living perimeter of muscle and iron around the jail, their presence a silent, formidable barrier between the prisoner and the mob. The night remained heavy, but the arrival of the regiment brought a different kind of gravity to the Crawford streets, as the military and civilian worlds stood locked in a silent, breathless standoff under the cold Nebraska stars. Within the hour, the word began to circulate among the officers that the barracks were not as they should be. 7 men were missing from the Troop B quarters, and several rifles had vanished from the racks. The perimeter around the jail tightened, the soldiers of Troops 1 and K sitting tall in their saddles, their eyes fixed on the shadows where the townspeople lingered. The clack of the Winchesters in the crowd was now met by the disciplined silence of the army, a silence that carried the weight of impending history. As the first hint of the coming day began to gray the horizon, the decision was finalized to move Reid under heavy guard, escaping the immediate threat of the lynch mob, but entering a long, legal winter that would see him traded from one cage to another. The pre-dawn light of May 14th, 1906, did not bring the usual bird call or the gentle stirring of a prairie town waking to its labors. Instead, the air over Crawford, Nebraska, was thick with the metallic tang of rifle oil and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of several hundred horses. The 10th Cavalry, the legendary Buffalo Soldiers, had moved into the city limits not as visitors or customers, but as a wall of absolute authority. We can visualize the line of blue stretching across the dusty thoroughfares, a solid, unyielding row of Union blue wool uniforms that seemed to absorb the fading moonlight. The horses, having been ridden hard from the stables of Fort Robinson, stood with their heads low, their muscular necks lathered in a white, soapy sweat that glistened in the lantern light. There was no shouting from the ranks. These were professional soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns that had taken them across the globe, now sitting in their saddles and staring down the very neighbors they had protected for years. The Crawford mob, which only hours earlier had been a chaotic swarm of indignation and whispered threats of lynching, found itself paralyzed by the stillness of the soldiers. It is a peculiar thing how the silence of a disciplined man can be louder than the roar of a crowd. The glint of the moon caught the polished steel of fixed bayonets held by the infantry backup, creating a serrated edge of light that warned anyone against stepping closer to the jailhouse. Colonel Auger, a man whose career was defined by the strict adherence to military order, did not negotiate with the town's anger. He moved with a systematic, chilling precision, turning the chaos of a civilian riot into a tactical recovery operation. As the morning mist clung to the buffalo grass at the town limits, the only sound to break the quiet was the methodical thud of soldiers' boots. Under Auger's command, the troops began a rhythmic sweep of the outskirts, their legs disappearing into the tall, dew-heavy stalks. We hear the dry crunch of the vegetation as they kicked through the undergrowth, searching for the hardware of a mutiny. One by one, the 14 missing Springfield rifles were recovered from their hiding spots, pulled from the shadows of the prairie like discarded secrets. Each rifle found was a weight removed from the tension, yet the heavy silence remained. The townspeople watched from behind porch railings and darkened windows, realizing with a sinking clarity that the military would not blink first. The standoff was not just between men, but between the raw emotion of a frontier town and the cold, ironclad resolve of the United States Army. By the time the sun fully cleared the horizon, the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The street was no longer a stage for a lynching, but a corridor of federal law, held firmly by the men in blue who refused to move until the last embers of the night's rage had turned to ash. The transfer of Sergeant John Reid from the immediate volatility of Crawford to the county seat in Chadron was a journey of 24 miles. Yet it felt like a passage between two different worlds. In the quiet of the jail cell, the sounds of the cavalry's bugles were replaced by the rhythmic tolling of the courthouse clock, a steady reminder that the machinery of the law had begun its slow, deliberate rotation. When the trial finally commenced, the atmosphere inside the Dawes County Courthouse was thick with a heavy, sedentary heat that seemed to trap the history of the building within its walls. There was a pervasive scent of old, yellowing paper and the sharp, medicinal sting of fresh floor wax that had been applied to the wooden benches in anticipation of the crowds. As the proceedings began, the only sound that dared to break the stillness of the room was the relentless, rhythmic scratching of the court reporter's pen across the page, capturing every whispered testimony and every sharp objection for the permanent record of the state. The prosecution moved with a clinical detachment, laying out the events of that May evening near the city park. Yet the air remained charged with a tension that the legal jargon could not quite mask. This tension was perhaps most visible in the composition of the jury. 12 men, all of them white, who sat in the box with stoic expressions, tasked with deciding the fate of a black soldier in a town still mourning its fallen marshal. Outside the heavy oak doors, the reality of the situation was even more palpable. In a display of silent, disciplined solidarity, 300 soldiers from Fort Robinson stood in formation on the courthouse lawn. They did not shout, and they did not carry their rifles. Yet their presence was a powerful, wordless statement that resonated through the glass panes of the courtroom windows. They remained there for hours, a sea of blue uniforms against the dusty Nebraska landscape, waiting for a verdict that would signal whether the scales of justice would tip or hold firm. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was thin but steady, cutting through the silence of the packed gallery. He read the phrasing of the sentence with a precision that left no room for ambiguity. John Reid was found guilty of manslaughter in the death of Arthur Moss. The penalty was set at 7 years of hard labor within the gray stone walls of the Nebraska State Prison. For Reid, the transition from the structured life of a cavalry sergeant to the anonymity of an inmate was a quiet folding of a chapter that had begun with a summer horse race and ended in a flash of gunpowder. The soldiers outside eventually dispersed, returning to the fort as the sun began its long descent, leaving the town of Crawford to settle back into its routines. The anger that had once threatened to burn the jail down began to fade into the collective memory of the region, leaving behind only the cold facts of a ledger and the stillness of a closed case. You are safe now, and as the echoes of the courtroom fade, you can let the weight of the day drift away, knowing that the storms of the past have finally reached their shore. The iron gates of the Nebraska State Prison closed behind John Reid, marking the beginning of a long, quiet sentence that would stretch across the next 7 years of his life. The transition from the high-tension barracks of Fort Robinson and the chaotic streets of Crawford to the rhythmic, muted existence of a stone cell block was a profound shift in reality. In the world outside, the year 1906 began to age into 1907, and the seasons turned with a predictable, heavy grace over the Nebraska plains. The grass on the hills of the military reservation grew long and turned to gold under the summer sun, then lay flat and brittle beneath the winter snows. Undisturbed by the boots of the men who had once gathered there for a beer party that ended in a tragedy of errors. Inside the prison walls, the intensity of that May night was replaced by a different kind of endurance. The legal system had weighed the evidence, the history of animosity between the marshal and the sergeant, the frantic shots fired in the dark, and the sanctuary sought in a quiet home. And it had reached its final conclusion. John Reid was no longer a soldier or a fugitive. He was a number in a ledger, a man tasked with reflecting on a single moment of violence that had rewritten his entire future. The 7-year sentence for manslaughter was a heavy burden, yet it carried the inherent promise of an end. Unlike the finality that had met Arthur Moss or the young Private Jordan Taylor, Reid's story was one of waiting, of watching the shadows move slowly across the floor of a cell, while the rest of the world moved on without him. The community of Crawford, once a powder keg of racial tension and civic fury, gradually found its pulse slowing. The presence of the extra troops from the fort eventually became unnecessary, and the soldiers returned to their drills, their horses, and the quiet discipline of the frontier post. The rifles that had been found hidden near the town limits were gathered and accounted for, no longer symbols of a potential uprising, but merely cold steel and wood. The memory of the soldier's escape began to lose its sharp edges, becoming a tale told in hushed tones over dinner tables, a reminder of how quickly the peace of a small town can be shattered when old grudges meet a moonless night. As the years drifted by, the names of the men involved started to fade from the front pages of the newspapers, replaced by newer stories and the steady march of the 20th century. The anger was gone, replaced by a somber understanding that justice, however imperfect, had been served. We find ourselves looking back at these events from a place of absolute safety. The cells are empty now. The fort is a quiet historical landmark, and the spirits of those involved have long since found their rest. The world is still, the air is cool, and the echoes of the past are nothing more than a gentle hum in the distance. You can let go of the tension now, allowing the silence to wrap around you like a heavy quilt, safe in the knowledge that the night is long and the morning is still far away.